The News Today with Lucy Aharish.
Good evening and welcome to the news today. Baltimore is still protesting, and so are cities elsewhere in the United States. Demonstrations sparked by the death in custody of African-American Freddie Gray have spread to New York, Seattle, Boston, Washington, D.C., and Minneapolis. The U.S. Justice Department has opened an investigation into the death of Gray, who suffered fatal spinal injuries when arrested. The Washington Post has reported that, according to a police document, Gray was, quote, banging against walls inside the police vehicle after he was arrested. Before we will start discussing the bigger picture in the United States, let's take a look back.
We have to come to terms with some hard truths about race and justice in America.
We can't just leave this to the police. I think there are police departments that have to do some soul searching. I think there's some communities that have to do some soul searching. But I think we as a country have to do some soul searching.
And with me to understand a little bit more about what is happening in the United States is Mitchell Barak, pollster, commentator, and political analyst. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. And also Dr. Udi Sommer, associate professor of political science at the Tel Aviv University. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. So let's start to understand, because this is not a new phenomenon. This is not something that we can say that it specifically happened. It's something, you know, occasional. It's something that happened in a certain point and explode. This is something that's been happening under the surface, or maybe above the surface, and now it's getting bigger and bigger. And we're talking about 2015. We're not talking about 60, 50, 70 years ago.
Yeah, well, I think especially given the fact that you have an African-American man in the White House, the frustration or maybe even the disillusionment with the notion that, once Barack Obama, the first African-American man to be elected president, assumed office in 2008, there was a sense that maybe America is in a post-racial era, or arrived at a post-racial era, but the facts on the ground are different. The facts on the ground, the roots of the discrimination, the roots of the disparities go back, decades and even centuries ago, and therefore. In hindsight, maybe it's not surprising that America is not in a post-racial era, but in the hearts and minds of people on the street, it's very frustrating for sure. Sorry.
So, it's in the hearts of minds, and sometimes I'm looking about what is happening here in Israel, and sometimes we're trying to explain to people outside. We just spoke about it, about the differences between Mizrahi Jews and Sephardi Jews, and who they are, and that the Israeli society is also divided, especially after the Israeli elections. And it seems that the same cases in the United States, when you see the demonstrations, you see white people and black people going out and demonstrating. And what I'm trying to understand is what is causing these officers to have such an easy finger on the trigger.
Well, this is a historical divide. This is not just a difference of Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews. I mean, first of all, look back historically, meaning a lot of the descendants, the people that are demonstrating, were brought to America forcibly, many of them for slavery. When they were released as slaves, they were still discriminated against, and it took a very, very long time until they even got the right to vote, meaning this recent movie about Selma, Alabama, this is in the 1960s. So it's taken a very long time to do that. And I think part of it is there are black people serving in the military, black people in the White House, African Americans that are in the police force, but a lot of the crimes, there was just an article in the New York Times, which is very important to bring up, about for how every 100 black women that are living in a city, there's only 80 males. 20% or 30%, depending on the city, are missing because they're in jail or they've died young. So the whole structure of the family is different. The whole structure of what it looks like is different. And it's a very, very difficult cycle to break. And many of these demonstrations we're seeing are happening in inner cities. And it's like a powder keg because they're living in inner cities and not the best conditions. And these kinds of things with the police can just, put it the other way.
Yes, before we're continuing this, let's take a look at how the anger and protest in Baltimore has spread across the United States in a report from ABC News.
No racist police!
Still taking to the streets their demands for justice.
We stand as a nation. We fight for our rights.
Protests against the alleged police assault on Freddie Gray, who died of a fractured spine after his arrest, spreading from Baltimore City Hall to the steps of the White House.
This is what democracy looks like.
To New York City, where police arrested protesters blocking traffic. But back in Baltimore, peace prevailed on a second night of curfew enforced by 2,000 National Guard troops and 1,000 police officers after the city erupted Monday into rioting, looting, and arson.
People are picking up bags and brooms and cleaning up. Parents are keeping kids at home and off the streets.
The Baltimore Symphony playing an outdoor concert as calm returns to the city, but precautions still in place. The stands empty Wednesday at Camden Yards. A Major League Baseball game closed to the public for the first time ever. And that mother seen in this viral video angrily going after her son after seeing him in the crowd with a rock says her teen has learned a humbling lesson.
I trust that he'll understand at the end what I did was not for the cameras, but was for the love that I have for him.
Yes, and ABC's Marcy Gonzalez is in Baltimore. Marcy, good evening.
Good evening, Lucy.
So, Marcy, let's try to understand. Does it look like violence is calming down in Baltimore for the long run?
They're dealing with it quite well. There's been a curfew in place over the past 2 nights going into effect at 10 p.m. Police and the National Guard have been out enforcing it. And last night, when it hit 10 p.m., the crowds who had been out protesting really seemed to clear very quickly. Meanwhile, police have handed over their preliminary findings into the cause of Freddie Gray's death over to the state's attorney's office, and they will continue the investigation. There is still some frustration, though, that the details of that report for now are not being made public. Lucy?
Yes, Marcy, thank you very much for this report from you.
Thank you.
So, like we're hearing, this is, I'm trying to go back, and we're always trying to go back to the basis, and the basis is education, is where it went wrong in the American education. How come, after all this time, the education system, the culture, wasn't able to bring these two sides together and make people understand that there is no difference between black and white?
So I think if you look at the statistics, you realize that there are certain aspects. If you look at the education system, for instance, federal records show that the likelihood that a young boy who has all sorts of behavioral problems in school will be expelled from school is significantly larger than the likelihood of a white boy with the exact same characteristics, other than the fact that he is white. So there are problems within the educational system. There are problems in the justice system. Okay, the likelihood of a black man being shot by the police is 21 times larger than the likelihood of a white man being shot by the police force. And those problems are structural in the sense, we have to remember that America is a federal system. As Israelis, we think, what's the big deal? You ask the police commissioner to change the recruiting strategies, right? You change the makeup of the police force, and that's great, right? It might happen take 2 or 3 years, but it's something that could happen in the foreseeable future. In the United States, things are way more complicated in that sense. We have, so Barack Obama is an African-American president who had an attorney general who is African-American, the first African-American man, Eric Holder, now an African-American African-American woman. Loretta Lynch took his position, and still the justice system is not reformed. How come? Well, the reason is that law enforcement in the United States is very, very complicated. You can't. So in many cases, what we see on the streets, the police forces that we see on the streets, are not federal troops, right? They are state troops or local troops, and therefore, and you can't really federalize all of those troops. So the way to reform is very, very long. And in that sense, if you think about the responsibility of the central government, of President Obama, of course, they bear some of the responsibility, but those, as we said earlier, those roots go decades and centuries back.
If I could just add that in a lot of counties in the United States, sheriff is an elected position. So they actually run for sheriff, and it's elected by the people. So the people have to decide who they want to be the county sheriff, if you will.
So the county sheriff can, what, is the possibility that a county sheriff will be black is lower than he will be white?
Well, anyone can run. It depends on where he's running and so forth.
But that has to do with the research that you mentioned earlier. So the fact that African-American families and African-American men are in jail or not alive anymore mean that the structure of the family, as you mentioned, is gone, and therefore the entire community cannot really organize. So in many places, including, for instance, Ferguson, Missouri. In Ferguson, Missouri, you have a black majority since the beginning of the century. So how come this black majority is not translated into black government? We know that the government there is predominantly white. Is not translated into a black, or at least a relatively black police force,
or at least 50-50.
Yeah. So and the reason why is that if you don't have a stable family, if you don't have a stable relationship, you're not registered to vote. It's very hard to translate the numbers into actual political power.
A lot of them don't go out to vote, so that's also a problem, is that they don't go out and vote, and there's a large segment of the population, I don't know how large, that has a distrust for the law and a distrust for the system. And there are even people that say, do not talk to the police under any circumstances. Even if you see a crime, don't report it, don't tell. There's a whole big campaign in these inner cities because they don't trust the police. They think they're going to get railroaded if they get arrested.
You know, I want to take you to the fact that the United States just elected 6 years ago a black president. And the fact that it elected a black president, it was why? It was just to do a check and say, okay, here we have a black president, and that's it. But maybe this president, when he came into office, maybe he forgot that the fact that he is black has a big significance, because it is a symbol, because the United States wanted to pick a black president, and because he cannot forget the color of his skin.
Well, I think that there are some people that voted for him, and that was an important point, and there's some people that voted for him, and the fact that he was black didn't have an important component to it. But what I think is also important is Barack Obama did not have the typical black experience growing up. His father was black, he was raised by his mother and his grandparents, and he really grew up a lot in Hawaii. So he didn't have an inner city kind of youth experience. So I think it's a little different. I do think that in America, that I think it's really a historic day when he was elected, and that it didn't stop because there is racism.
More than that, it's like giving these youngsters a big
For a lot of them, he also didn't have a father he was raised by his mother, so he also had an absentee father that he only met.
It's a big example that where you can achieve and what you can reach, and that there is no limit.
It should be, but it's a very difficult for many of them to break out of the system. You know, you have to graduate high school, and it's very difficult if you're in a high school program where not everyone is committed to study. And you know, you don't get the extra help as in white neighborhoods. You know, you asked about America and relations. I can tell you about my experience growing up. I grew up in the 70s in New York in a predominantly Jewish suburb, and at that point I went to public school, in elementary school, and the federal government decided to bus in. You could not have all white schools. You had to integrate. It was school integration. So we had black students coming from the other side of New Rochelle, New York, which is where I'm from, and there was not a lot of integration in the class, meaning they came from their reality, which was much different from the suburban reality that the Jewish and Italian kids, where most of the neighborhood was, who lived in houses, whose parents were married, who had 2 cars or 1 car, commuted to a job in the city, versus black kids from the projects that were being bused in.
Exactly from this point, because the fact that you integrate students together, the fact that you put them in the same class, it doesn't mean that this is where your work stops. It means that it's only where your work started. And it seems that in the American education system, they don't realize that you have to bring these 2 sides together and bridge between them, well, although they're living in the United States.
I'm not sure that I I beg to differ. Okay, so I think, for instance, if you look at higher education in the United States, if you look at affirmative action policies, okay, affirmative action policies today, the only reason why affirmative action policies are constitutional in the United States today, based on decisions of the Supreme Court, is the notion of diversity in the classroom. The idea that when you have a diverse classroom, the entire educational process, the entire educational experience is different. It benefits everybody, included, the students, the professors, and the entire experience. And so, for instance, that I think is a very important example for the fact that diversity does matter in the United States. But I think that also beside, so you mentioned earlier, how he was elected, etc., but there was also the notion of what has he done, right? He's the African-American president. What has he done? And
how
so,
all these problems are popping out, especially in his period?
So, okay, so I think this, why it's popping out, I think it has to do with the frustration and disillusionment. The expectations were sky high, and the reality is different. But if we look at President Obama's record, I think that in many ways he was very focused on being president of all Americans, but many of the policies that he put in place benefited African Americans a lot. So, for instance, if you think about the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare, the health care reform, the health care in America now allows for African Americans, who for the most part are not as well off as just like in the 1970s in New Rochelle, I guess, exactly the same, but the statistics are not that different. And this kind of affordable care, this kind of act allows this kind of public provision of health. It's a little more complicated than just public provision, but the fact of the matter is that this benefits blacks. The same thing with the justice system. I mean, the attorney generals that he appointed, they of course it's not something that you can change overnight, but they have made great effort, including in the specific cases, in Ferguson, Missouri,
yes,
and Staten Island, etc., to make sure that these minorities are protected.
I want to join to this conversation from U.S. From Baltimore. Now is Karen Abdul Malik, also known as Queen Noor, president of the National Association of Black Storytellers. Good evening. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you, and good afternoon.
Yeah, for us it's evening, and I believe that for you it's good afternoon. So Queen Noor, really, we're trying to understand this from the Israeli perspective, and sometimes we're thinking about it because we are here experiencing a lot of, let's say, differences between Arabs and Jews, between Jews among themselves, between even Arabs among themselves. And we know about diversity. We know about living together but not living the same culture, but it seems that it's becoming a big subject in the United States, and maybe this is surfacing again in the United States, and it was hidden. And my question is why it was hidden in the United States. Why no one gave it the attention that it needed to be given in order not to get to this point where young people are being killed and murdered because of the color of their skin?
First, let me say that it's not hidden. It's just that racism has been the big elephant in the room for a very long time, since its inception. And so it's not hidden, it's always been here. And it's just that from Trayvon Martin to Eric Gardner to Freddie Gray, more attention is being brought to it. It is a systemic problem. And just as I was listening to the broadcast and also seeing that the Ethiopian Israelis also are having to protest, it's systemic beyond the United States. And in the United States, what we must do is tell our stories. We can't have other people telling our stories. And so we must first tell the stories that are concealed and those stories of resistance, because those stories are the stories of victory that we have come through as Barack said earlier, the whole enslavement period and time period coming through that to this point. It is still stories that are concealed, and we must tell those stories and tell those stories to our youth so that they understand that we have victory. We do have victory.
Queen Noor, from my point of view, from someone who's living in Israel and reading and seeing what is happening in the United States, you're saying telling your story, spreading it out. I don't hear as Barack Obama, as the President of the United States, the first black President of the United States, actually telling his story, putting his story out there and saying this is one of the most important things that we need to discuss about, and not threats outside and not maybe the economy, because if we will tell these stories like you're saying, even we can bring this change in economy, this change in education. And for me, it was a little bit disappointing seeing it from outside, because we are dealing here with the same issues.
Right, it is not disappointing for me. And I heard you earlier say that, did Barack Obama forget? No, he has not forgotten. But you also cannot put every black person inside of the same story. And so we're not disappointed. And then what you said about the economy, it's all, the story of racism, economy is an affect of racism. And so when we tell our stories, we also must look to tell stories that are transformative. And we must come together in collective visions, not only with African Americans, but also with the other people in the United States, to tell stories that have collective visions of what do we want the United States to look like? How does equality look? And collectively, we can tell those stories and we can move there through story. And that's what we believe at the National Association of Black Storytellers.
Yeah, Queen Noor, it was a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for giving us your perspective and showing something else about what we don't know here in Israel. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you for having me.
Before we're continuing to speak and taking what she said further, i24 News reporter Uri Shapira takes a look at the sequence of violence over the last few years in the United States and some of the reasons and consequences of this ongoing crisis in divided America.
The clashes in Baltimore, which spread to other cities in the U.S. following the death of Freddie Gray, are just the latest in a chain of clashes over the last few years between American authorities and civilians. All of them came after controversial incidents involving the death of African Americans. Though in many of the cases the riots tended to fade after a while, the tension still remains, at least under the surface. In July 2013, George Zimmerman, member of a Florida Neighborhood Watch, was acquitted in court after fatally shooting African-American teen Trayvon Martin, and reactions were not long in coming. Thousands of people from coast to coast took to the streets, protesting what they saw as a clear failure of the justice system. Just 1 year later, another incident sparking outrage, this time in the city of Ferguson, Missouri. Young African-American Michael Brown was shot dead by white police officer Darren Wilson, who claimed that Brown disobeyed his order to move to the sidewalk. It was later revealed that Brown was unarmed. In November 2014, a grand jury decided not to press charges against Wilson, and once again, America found itself in the midst of violent protests. The next round of violence came when New Yorker Eric Garner, also African-American, was choked to death by NYPD officers in July 2014. From the mid-1960s until today, the United States has known many rounds of racial violence, and critics say little has been learned. Many point to the light police trigger finger, especially when the gun is aimed at minorities. Others accuse a legal system that fails to adequately punish offending police officers. But perhaps these riots reflect a deeper crisis in contemporary America, a growing frustration at the economic gap between the different sectors, a frustration that is threatening to tear the country apart.
Yes, and we were talking about storytelling, and Queen Noor said and talked about the storytelling, and basically it's the narrative. It's the minority asking to get their rights, and they're not getting it. And you just mentioned, we were just talking, you just mentioned, this is about getting equality, and the black people were the first one to get equality in the United States.
Exactly. So equality, that's the fundamental principle in the ethos of the United States, in the Constitution of the United States. The first one to get equality, as you said, under the 14th Amendment, right after the Civil War, African Americans. Women got it, almost 50 years later in the 1919, sorry. Even gays are getting equality today. I mean, there's a case under review in the U.S. Supreme Court about gay marriage that is probably, we'll hear the decision later in late June. So African Americans are watching women getting equality, are watching sexual minorities getting equality, and still they are in many ways left behind. And I think this is a cause of the frustration that we mentioned earlier.
I'm trying to, I'm hearing her, and I heard her, and I'm hearing myself. when we are talking about equality and racial issues here in Israel between Jews and Arabs, because again, if you will bring the, the job test, and you will bring two people, and one of them is Jewish and one of them is Arab, and they will have the same professional skills. At the end of the day, the Jewish person more likely to get the job than the Arab person and than the Arab man, and it's a problem, and I can understand this, because if since the beginning you're being judged, how can you even progress and not give up and say, come on, I got no chance?
Well, it's also about social networking, meaning, if I was looking for a job or you were looking for a job, you would have a lot of people to speak to that are in the industry and so forth, whereas really Arabs are not necessarily socializing in the same way with those people that might be working in companies or places that are providing jobs. So I think some of that is the same in the United States, meaning, if I look at, again, how the Jewish community lives in the United States, if you need some legal advice for something, there's 15 people you could ask right on your phone easily. If you're black growing up in America or Puerto Rican growing up in America, you might not know a lot of lawyers or a lot of doctors. So it's a different kind of upbringing there, and it's kind of like a parallel society to a certain extent.
It's this issue of integrating, of being together, of actually living together. The fact that they're right now like big cities and big neighborhoods that only contain like black people, it's for me, it's something that I cannot understand and I cannot digest.
Well, it's black people living an hour away from the White House, okay, living in a neighborhood, the specific neighborhood where Freddie Gray was arrested, has 97% of the people African Americans, and life expectancy there is more or less the life expectancy in Iraq and Kazakhstan. So definitely the segregation is there. Mitchell mentioned a few reasons for the structural segregation. We mentioned a few of them earlier, and those structural barriers are very, very hard to get over. So.
Yes, at least, you know what? We are facing the same problems that all the world is facing. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much. We're not unique. It's good. We're going out for a small break. 2 minutes and I'll be back.